Hola Gilbe, ¿nos escuchas? Estás con el micrófono cortado.
Hola, ¿me escuchas?
Es que está en mute.
No, es que no escucho.
Hola.
Ya.
Hola, Lara.
Hola, me
Hola.
acabo de presentarte, ¿no? Explicar
Hola.
la situación en Casanare. Pero hay
¿Cómo estás?
Bien, bien. Pero no te cuento la vida personal ahora porque hay mucha gente. Es demasiado interesante para eso.
Bueno.
Ok, ¿cómo estás Gilbe? ¿Bien?
Bien. Muy
Bueno, so I'm going to be translating everything that Gilberto is saying. Estoy diciendo que va a traducir todo lo que digas tú. Entonces, cuando estés listo, Gilbe, yo voy a ir traduciendo lo que digas.
¿Ya o de una vez?
Ya, de una vez.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos y todas.
Good evening for everybody.
Presento disculpas por no haber en mi juventud acumulada aprendido a hablar inglés, con lo cual pues me estoy apalancando de Vera.
I apologize for my accumulated youth and not be interested to still not be able to speak English, but okay.
No, está muy bien.
Está.
Que igual quiero agradecer esta participación, esta invitación por parte de la Universidad de Sussex, por parte de mi gran amiga Lara, por parte de Helena, mi estudiante preferida, en el cual me dio la oportunidad.
I want to say thank you for my participation in this event. I want to thank the University of Sussex. I want to thank my great friend Lara and my favorite student Helena for making this event happening. Okay.
Hago la aclaración de que eres mi alumna preferida porque me diste la oportunidad de ser parte de la tutoría de la tesis, con lo cual salió excelentemente bien por el trabajo hecho por ti, no por mí, por ti.
I want to make clear that she's my favorite student because I was able to be your gatekeeper for thesis, and she did a great work because of her, not me. It was me. Wow, okay.
Agradecer a todas las personas que tanto presencialmente como virtualmente están conectadas en este evento que para nosotros, los defensores de derechos humanos, los que creemos que otro mundo es posible, pues es muy gratificante y a la vez pues se hacía necesario.
I want to thank all of the people joining us online and in person, because for us, defenders of human rights and social leaders, it is very important and necessary to be sharing this information.
Bueno, creo que la presentación ya está hecha. Mi nombre es Gilberto Torres Martínez, ex dirigente sindical de la Unión Sindical Obrera de la Industria del Petróleo en Colombia.
My name is Gilberto Torres Martinez. I used to be a trade union leader of the USO, the union for oil workers in Colombia.
Y hoy en la actualidad, pues defensor de derechos humanos a nivel internacional y refugiado en la hermana República de Venezuela.
I'm currently a human rights defender and I'm exiled in our sister country, Venezuela.
Bueno, no sé por dónde empezar, pero intentaré resumir parte del por qué estamos hoy reunidos aquí. Gilberto Torres en el año 2002 fue secuestrado por parte de los grupos paramilitares en Colombia.
To talk a bit while the reason why we're here, Gilberto Torres was kidnapped in 2002 by the paramilitary groups in Colombia.
Fueron 42 días de secuestro, 10 de ellos torturado, amordazado y enterrado en un hueco en la selva colombiana.
It was 42 days of kidnapping, and 10 of those days I was tortured and I was kept in a hole in the Colombian jungle.
Todo esto, pues, por defender los derechos humanos, los derechos de los trabajadores de la industria petrolera, por el derecho de las regiones y de todo lo que tiene que ver con la defensa del medio ambiente.
All of this happened because of my defense for human rights, for the rights of oil workers, and for the rights of defending the environment.
Pues desafortunadamente para las empresas multinacionales que hacían presencia o que hacen presencia en la zona de Casanare,
Unfortunately for the multinationals that are present in the area of Casanare,
Gilberto Torres era la piedra en el zapato a sus necesidades economicistas y de producción petrolera, teniendo en cuenta que como defensor y como dirigente sindical, pues hacía y defendía los derechos de las comunidades y de los trabajadores, con lo cual pues, generaba paros de producción, que esto les afectaba a ellos.
unfortunately for them, Gilberto Torres was the stone in the shoe for the corporation that limited and put a stop to their desires for economic and capital accumulation, a resistance which meant a lot of trouble for them.
Esto hizo que después de el asesinato de Auris Aramarrugo en el 2001, en diciembre del 2001, en febrero del 2002, el 25 de febrero del 2002 exactamente, yo fuera secuestrado por los grupos paramilitares del Casanare.
This meant that on el 21 de diciembre,
el 5 de diciembre, secuestraron y asesinaron a Auris Ara.
This meant that on the 5th of December, there was the murder of my compa Auris Ara, who was also a trade union leader. And it also meant, perdón, me repites después de lo de Auris Ara.
El 25 de febrero es cuando me secuestran a mí.
And it also meant my own kidnapping on the 25th of February.
Y fueron 42 días de secuestro.
Which meant 42 days of kidnapping.
Y que hoy se sabe que gracias a todas las investigaciones y a las denuncias y a las diferentes demandas, hoy se sabe que fueron las empresas petroleras.
And today, after all the investigations, all the demands for justice that have been made, we can certainly know and acknowledge that it was from paramilitaries that were contracted by the transnational corporations.
Empresas que estaban asociadas o estaban recogidas en la sociedad OCENSA, la multinacional OCENSA, como lo era la BP, Total, Triton, TransCanadá y Ecopetrol, que es la empresa estatal colombiana.
Corporations such as OCENSA, which is BP's branch in Colombia, TransCanadá, Ecopetrol, that is located in Colombia. ¿Qué fue lo último de?
Sí, está bien. Y que pues en los diferentes juicios a los diferentes paramilitares, todos coinciden en que fue OCENSA o las multinacionales las que pagaron más de 100 millones de pesos colombianos para que me asesinaran y me desaparecieran.
And after all the judicial efforts, it is confirmed that it was OCENSA, DP's branch in Colombia, who paid 100 million Colombian pesos as a price tag for my own murder.
Y bueno, hoy se preguntarán ustedes que por qué sigo vivo. Soy el segundo dirigente sindical que sale vivo de un secuestro paramilitar después de décadas. El primer compañero fue de Cementos de Antioquia, una región en Colombia que fue liberado y era dirigente de Cementos de Antioquia en la década de los 70.
You will ask yourself why I'm still alive, being the only second union leader in the history of Colombia to come out alive after kidnapping. The first one was a few decades before, a compañero of mine that worked in the cement industry in Antioquia, in Colombia, also a union leader.
Pues fue la solidaridad, fue los movimientos sociales, fue gracias a Dios, a las oraciones de mi madre y demás, las que finalmente hoy hagan que Gilberto Torres se encuentre dando esta manifestación de vida y dando este testimonio ante ustedes.
Well, it was about solidarity, it was about unity, it was about social movements and international cooperation. It was about the prayers from my mother and all my friends that mean that I am here to tell this story in front of all of you.
Adicionalmente, pues el paro de 24 días en la industria petrolera por parte de mi organización sindical hace que el gobierno nacional se vea abocado a negociar con los grupos paramilitares por la falta o la escasez de combustible en las grandes ciudades en Colombia.
Additionally, it was due to a 24-day strike, which was organized by the union leaders of the oil industry in Colombia, that was demanding. ¿Qué estaba demandando qué, perdón?
O sea, el gobierno le toca negociar con los paramilitares para que me liberaran porque había desabastecimiento y como las refinerías y toda la industria petrolera estaba en 0% de producción, pues eso hizo que el gobierno metiera las manos para buscar mi liberación.
And it occurred because the government was forced to negotiate with the paramilitaries because after this strike, there was nothing left of gasoline due to the strike that they took upon. Therefore, there was a lot of pressure in the negotiations with the government so that to demand the liberation of Gilberto and to set him free from his kidnapping.
Bueno, pues fueron 42 días, como lo decía, 10 de ellos enterrados en la selva colombiana y que el 7 de abril finalmente fui entregado a la Comisión Internacional de la Cruz Roja.
It was 42 days, and as I said, 10 of them were spent buried in the Colombian jungle. And on the 7th of April, there was a rescue mission that was led by the Red Cross.
Este grupo paramilitar exigía que yo tenía que salir de la región porque yo era un peligro para la comunidad, ¿no?
This paramilitary group was saying that I had to leave the territory and the community as I was being posed as a threat to the society.
Bueno, fue así como me trasladaron para Bogotá junto con mi núcleo familiar Y estando en Bogotá, a los 10 días se conoce por parte del Corporativo de Seguridad de Ecopetrol y de Ocensa que había un comando paramilitar que me iba a asesinar.
It was after 10 days when I had arrived in Bogota with my family that it became known that there was a direct link between the paramilitary groups and Ocensa, BP's branch, that made the command for my kidnapping.
Bueno, para no ser tan largo toda la historia, pues evidentemente se han hecho una serie de demandas, tanto a nivel internacional como a nivel nacional en Colombia, lo que ha generado pues que hoy la cúpula de los paramilitares del Casanare estén pagando las condenas que la ley colombiana les emite por el secuestro y bueno, por la violación de los derechos humanos a Gilberto Torres como dirigente sindical y como ser humano.
To make a long story short, after there was a whole series of actions of litigations nationally and internationally, there was después de lo de las de los esfuerzos de litigio nacionales e internacionales para garantizar tu libertad como ser humano, ¿cierto?
No, se condenan, o sea, ya vienen las condenas a los grupos a la cúpula de los grupos paramilitares.
Okay, sorry. So after this effort of litigation, then became, the search for justice to condemn the paramilitary groups.
Esto, de acuerdo a la ley colombiana, estos hechos le generaron condenas de 38 a 45 años de prisión en algunos casos.
According to the Colombian law, this generated 35 to 40 years of jail time in some cases.
Pero claro, desafortunadamente todavía pues los procesos de demanda siguen y lo que se espera es poder llevar ante los tribunales a los autores intelectuales, teniendo en cuenta que pues los grupos paramilitares son...
Un segundito. Unfortunately, at the moment, the struggle continues and we are still attempting through the justice system to reveal the intellectual authors of the crimes.
Entonces, pues, como digo, los procesos siguen. En su momento se llevó la demanda al Reino Unido, demandándose a la BP, pues, por su participación como accionista en este secuestro o en el pago.
In my personal case, it's an ongoing case. Even we came to the UK and made a case against BP due to my kidnapping and BP's direct involvement in that.
Y pues en Colombia pues se tiene demandado también a los grupos paramilitares, al país y evidentemente a las empresas multinacionales.
In Colombia, we're still doing some action in litigation against the Colombian state and against the companies as well.
Estamos esperando pues tener un testimonio fehaciente por parte del jefe paramilitar para que él cuente así pues, o de un testimonio donde determine la participación específica, en este caso de BP.
We're still waiting for testimony by the paramilitary leader for him to confess and to be clear about the direct involvement of BP in my case.
BP, Total, Triton, Ecopetrol, bueno, todo en sí para que los autores e intelectuales que pagaron los 100 millones de pesos, pues también sean llevados ante la justicia.
We're still waiting for BP, Ecopetrol, and all of these transnational corporations that are paying for these kidnappings to be served upon the justice system and for justice to be served against them.
Este caso que ha sido emblemático en Colombia, pues por las connotaciones políticas y sociales y humanitarias, teniendo en cuenta pues
This case that has
todos los líderes.
This case that has been emblematic in Colombia due to all the political and social causes and taking into account all the effects of all these social leaders.
Pues lo que se ha planteado en su momento es investigar, y de ahí que se hizo toda una serie de investigaciones que permitieran mínimamente que tuviéramos herramientas jurídicas para evitar que las empresas multinacionales que hacen presencia en nuestros países pues violen las leyes de los países, pero
After this, there was a lot of jurisdiction cases put forward to try to bring justice against the corporations that are coming into our countries and into our territories, and to try to guarantee that they stop violating human rights.
Y para ello, pues, con todo el entusiasmo y esa dinámica que tiene Lara, que tiene un grupo de académicos de la Universidad de Sussex, como de la Universidad Libre en Colombia, como los compañeros y compañeras de Lara.
After this, with all the enthusiasm that we can see by people like Lara, by people like the academic team of Sussex, of the Universidad Libre en Colombia, and of the social movement called Aurizara.
Sebastian también de War on One.
As well as Sebastian from War on One.
Mi abrazo, mi cariño desde aquí, desde esta tierra bolivariana, Sebas.
I give him a big hug and all my love from this Bolivarian land.
Pues se hizo todo un estudio, toda una investigación, tanto en Colombia como en África y en Reino Unido, pues para consolidar en un libro una herramienta jurídica que nos pueda permitir hacia un futuro que estas prácticas.
We took on a wide and complete investigation in places in Latin America, in Africa, and in other places to develop a book where we could have the material tools to lead the way in which we can use law strategically against these practices.
Y bueno, pretendemos que con estas herramientas y con todo lo que se vaya dando en torno al caso de Gilberto Torres, pues podamos en un momento determinado hacer que haya los que generen leyes internacionales, a pesar de que ya existen, pero que se generen estas leyes pues para que las multinacionales, como habitualmente lo hacen, porque esto es una práctica de ellas en nuestros países, violar los derechos humanos, los derechos de los pueblos.
We hope that with these laws and with these efforts, we can pave a path to widen the meanings of international law that already exist, but get ignored. So yeah, to like make sure that the international law systems in place do occur in favor of protecting human rights.
Y bueno, pues ya para terminar mi intervención, que me alargué mucho, pero bueno.
Finish my intervention that got a bit long.
Nuevamente agradecerles, decirles que en Colombia está la Drummond, está Jocol, están otras empresas que hoy en
I want to say that in Colombia we have transnationals like Tribunal, like BP, that today
que hoy han violado los derechos humanos y fundamentales de los pueblos, sobre todo de los pueblos indígenas en La Guajira.
continue to violate the fundamental rights of the peoples, especially of indigenous peoples in the Colombian Guajira.
Con lo cual, pues, desde aquí es la invitación a cada uno de ustedes a que nos acompañen en las diferentes denuncias que desde Colombia y desde muchas partes de Latinoamérica y del mundo, pues hacemos en torno a la no violación.
With this, I want to invite all of you to walk along with us in the efforts to bring justice and using litigation strategically to stop the aberration of human rights.
Y bueno, finalmente, muchas gracias por la invitación, muchas gracias por permitirme desde este lado del Atlántico poder contarles un poquito esta historia, este hecho que hoy, pues desafortunadamente para muchos y muchas, no han tenido la suerte de estar vivos. Yo hoy la tengo y agradezco a la vida, a Dios, a toda esa solidaridad nacional e internacional que se abocó para.
Finally, I want to say thank you all for listening to me, you know, and the fact that I'm still alive to tell this story, despite that many like me are not here to tell it. And this is due to national and international solidarity. So I want to say thank you for listening. Gracias, Gilbert. Chao, Gilbert. Después te llamo, ¿ok?
So don't end the meeting.
Don't,
It's fine for Gilberto to say if he wants to, but he won't speak to
sí.
you.
Gilbert, entonces, si quieres, puedes seguir en las llamadas.
It's gone. Se fue. Hopefully we can stream it out.
Gracias.
Still now, yeah? Still now.
So it's going to be filmed. We've got two. I've got two films. The other one's going to take 2 hours. Okay, you got 2 films? Yeah.
It was meant to be first. Still now.
Siempre dijiste lo que Hola, Gilberto. Un abrazo, hermano.
¿Cómo estás, hermano? Qué alegría.
Igual, querido.
¿Qué pasó con el cabello?
Me estoy poniendo serio. Mentiras, me lo puse hace un ratito ya. Sorry.
Okay, we got
Yeah, I'm just going to try and get screen now.
no, the one that I sent you here.
Yeah, got it. Facebook.
Okay, first sentence is ready.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, thank you everyone for listening to Gilberto. As you can see, he's a very special person that can still use humor despite talking about some of the most heavy things you could ever hear about. And now we're going to show you a brief video from the Yukpa community. This video was brought by Owaya, an NGO based in Colombia, Medellin, and they're going to talk a bit about their situation in the mine and tell us a bit directly about, how they're resisting and everything.
Nosotros vivíamos,
Yeah, so this was made especially for this event. For everyone here to hear.
en un primer momento en el valle de la serranía del Perijá, que hoy son las palmeras, que hoy son...
Oh wait, there's no subtitles in this. There are subtitles, aren't there?
No, there are.
Did you think I might have downloaded the wrong version? I saw subtitles. That's the second one, isn't it?
That's anonymous, but I definitely.
I wonder how to get them. Does anybody know how to get subtitles to be quickly visible on QuickTime?
Is it not? Maybe it's connected or something.
It's showing you.
Oh, that
Donde
was so weird.
nosotros vivíamos en un primer momento.
Okay, wait. I don't know.
You know what?
Lo que tú digas que la idea es armar una estrategia para apoyar a esta comunidad, ¿no? ¿Se lo debe hacer?
Pues, ¿lo puedo decir otra vez? Sí, so the reason why we're showing this video is because, like, in the second part of this event, we want to form a long-term strategy working with the Yukpas community and the people that are going to speak right now, and to try to build international bridges of cooperation against the transnationals that have the offices here in the UK an hour away from us.
Nosotros vivíamos en un primer momento en el valle de la serranía del Perijá, que hoy son las palmeras, que hoy son donde se explota la gran minería a gran escala y de acero abierto en dos grandes empresas multinacionales como es Bloom y Glencore, llamada más conocida como Prodeco, fueron, como dicen ellos, civilizando la tierra.
¿Aló?
Y para nosotros eso fue como el mayor daño que se hizo en ese momento, pues civilizar una montaña de 1000, de 2000, 3000 años. Figúrese usted todo lo que nos quitaron a nosotros. La segunda explotación más grande en Colombia se da en nuestro territorio ancestral. 14.000 kilómetros a cielo abierto se explotan en nuestro territorio para la gran minería, para ese carbón que dice ser el desarrollo, no para Colombia, sino para otros países que se nutren y se lucran de ese gran carbón. Pero ese carbón que utilizan allá lleva más de 50 niños muertos en nuestro territorio, solo del resguardo soporte. Todas esas multinacionales se fueron, consultaron con quién, con los alcaldes, con los dirigentes de allá abajo. Al pueblo de Yukpa nunca se les consultó eso. Entonces hoy en día nosotros nos vienen a consultar ya cuando el daño está hecho. Entonces, ¿qué ocurrió con eso? Desviaron el río. Y hoy en día Usted mira el río que era de la pesca y ya no hay pescado sin los sardinos.
Hoy nos toca salir a comprar una libra de pescado que vale 10.000 pesos, que muchos indígenas, por el cambio climático que ya nuestros productos no se dan como se daban anteriormente, por la ruptura del sistema de vida que teníamos, y que eso hoy le llaman cambio climático, y la contaminación de la gran escala de la minería hace que los tiempos no sean iguales.
Y así hemos tenido todas esas violaciones al territorio que hoy en día nosotros estamos reclamando. Estamos ya hoy en día con el tema de la limitación de nuestro territorio. En eso estamos como en esa lucha en la recuperación de lo que nosotros hemos perdido.
Y sumado a esa agua y a esa minería, el conflicto armado que amenazó líderes, que confinó líderes, que secuestró gente en nuestro territorio, que enterró gente en nuestro territorio.
Porque quisieron llegar a acabar al pueblo Yukpas, los paramilitares. Pero ahí tuvimos una resistencia fuerte, el pueblo Yukpas, que dijimos, nos tocan un Yukpas para los paramilitares o cualquier grupo armado, nos tocan a todos.
Muchos de este conflicto armado fue financiado por las multinacionales. En el caso de Codeco tenemos la gran investigación que han hecho otros gremios a nivel del mundo. Hoy Bloom está en el tema de la JEP para la reparación de la verdad, dando declaraciones por muchos sindicalistas que mataron en su momento, apoyados por las multinacionales y por los gobiernos de turno.
También sabemos que no es solo el pueblo Yupa que lleva esta lucha, no es solo el pueblo Yupa que defendemos el territorio, no es solo el pueblo Yupa que defendemos la madre naturaleza.
Lo que nosotros invitamos en el mundo entero donde estén estas causas es que no se detengan nunca, que no bajen la guardia, que sigan con ánimo, que lo que es de uno no tiene uno por qué pedir. Lo que uno tiene uno que luchar y recuperar.
Si sabemos que los jóvenes pueden sacar adelante sus pueblos, sus raíces, sus territorios, lo pueden hacer porque no están solos, sus ancestros los acompañan y están en ellos esos ancestros diciéndoles, usted puede defender lo que nosotros dejamos, usted puede defender los derechos.
Tenemos que pensar aterrizadamente, no podemos pensar desde el cielo para abajo, sino desde la tierra hacia el cielo. Hoy los pueblos indígenas tenemos un legado en el mundo, podría decir, y desde el mundo Yupa podemos decir que nosotros queremos invitar a todas aquellas personas que se sumen a la defensa territorial. Porque créanme que no hay una fábrica de agua en el mundo. Eso no lo va a inventar el hombre, no va a haber una fábrica de oxígeno, porque la fábrica del oxígeno puro son nuestras montañas, el agua son los ríos. Nuestra madre naturaleza tiene vida y debemos de cuidarla, debemos de respetarla. Y no solo desde nuestro territorio, desde cualquier espacio se puede ayudar para que nuestra madre tierra y para que el mundo, para que la humanidad respire y puro tome agua pura y sea fuente de vida. Entonces a eso es que me invito como gran Yukpa, como pueblo Yukpa, como guerrero, como cazador, como recolector, es a cuidar a nuestra madre tierra.
Yeah, that's the Yukpa people who we would be collaborating and working with. And now I'm going to show you another quick video from Eduard Alvarez. He's a sociologist that has been working for over 20 years with the Yukpa people in terms of strategic litigation. So he's going to talk a bit as well.
El caso se presenta en la serranía del Pescado, departamento del Cesar, la costa norte de Colombia. Se trata del pueblo indígena Yukpa, únicos descendientes de los caribes y único pueblo en la costa caribe que tiene la condición de ser nómada, seminómada y agricultores y liberales. en el año de 1996, las empresas multinacionales Glencore y Drummond crearon el Frente Juan Andrés Álvarez de las Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia. Y al finalizar los procesos de licenciamiento tanto del puerto como de las minas a cielo abierto, el frente se desmoviliza. Es decir, utilizaron a un grupo paramilitar para licenciar los proyectos, desplazaron a todos los campesinos y subieron a los Yukpas en las partes altas de la serranía del Pescado. Hoy, 25 niños por lo menos al año se mueren por desnutrición, asociados a la pérdida del territorio y a las afectaciones mineras energéticas. Por estos motivos hemos adelantado unos litigios estratégicos en contra de las mineras y con el propósito de salvaguardar los derechos fundamentales del pueblo indígena. La Corte Constitucional en el año 2017 ordenó la delimitación y ampliación del territorio ancestral. Situación y compromisos que el presidente Iván Duque no cumplió. No se delimitó el territorio ancestral ni se ampliaron los resguardos. Y en el año 2020, el Consejo de Estado ordenó la suspensión de todos los futuros proyectos mineros energéticos en la serranía del Pericardio. El presidente Iván Duque está licenciando los proyectos, está otorgando los títulos mineros sin garantizar el derecho fundamental a la consulta previa. Muchas gracias. Eduardo Álvarez, asesor técnico del pueblo indígena.
I just wanted to highlight the fact that we're going to be working in this campaign closely with Eduardo Álvarez, and he's going to be part of the strategy formation in the region of Colombia. Now I'm going to present our next speaker tonight, Lara Montesinos Coleman. Lara is a reader in international relations, law and development in the University of Sussex. Lara has been writing for a long time about Colombia, and a lot of this event is actually based on one of her books that she co-authored called Writing Corporate Wrongs, Strategic Use of Law Against Extractivism. A lot of this organization came like from Lara's class, a lot of the organizers here. And so if you haven't, I really recommend for you to read her work if you want to learn more about, resistance against extractivism. And as I like to say, it's almost like having a Molotov cocktail for breakfast. So be prepared for that. But please give a warm welcome to Lara.
Thanks, Helena. And yeah, thanks to all of my third year global resistance class who've been involved in organising this event. And to, can you hear me okay? Is it, can you hear me at the back? Do you need a microphone? Maybe. No, you can hear. Okay. So yeah, my third year class, well, a number of my third year class actually organised this event, partly because we were on strike when they were going to have their class on strategic use of law. I think this was originally going to be a strike teach out and then became this event. So
before you start, sorry, should I put the projector back on so Lara can keep sitting? Did you like that? Because you could see her bigger. Or I'm aware that it's a full room and
can you see me? Is that
okay? Lara audible and visible in this
Am I audible and visible? Yeah.
Yes, no? You want the screen back on?
It
felt a little bit weird, a bit sort of postmodern.
It feels very close when I'm looking at myself. Yeah. I guess I'll appear behind myself as well in a minute. I just wanted to start off just by sort of linking up a little bit some of the issues that yeah. Harder to hear with technology, it doesn't help. I just want to start linking up what Gilberto was talking about in his own case with the situation of the Yukpas. So if you don't know much about Colombia, you'll pick up, I think, from these two interventions that in Colombia there are right-wing paramilitary despots still working with numerous multinational corporations corporations. So Chiquita Bernarda actually admitted to giving $1.7 million to paramilitaries and to providing them with AK-47s. I mean, this is not a kind of secret thing. It's like very, very well documented by all sorts of human rights bodies that many companies have been involved in acts like displacing the Yukpa people. So they were displaced from where the mining was going to take place, which meant they weren't on the land to then exercise their right of prior consultation over mining on their territory, which was a deliberate strategy. And this has happened in many other parts of the country. And then Gilberto's situation, I mean, he's only one of 2 trade union leaders to survive this sort of thing, but there's actually a term, sindicalicidio, that was invented basically by a Colombian historian, Helena Müllenbach, to talk about the genocide of trade unions. So actually, like, people who are organizing for labor rights and often organizing with wider communities over arboration, ecological issues, over hunger and so on. Many people, again, were and still continue to be killed, displaced, and so on by these paramilitaries. And then the other thing I just wanted to add to that is that Colombia is not unique, right? There's different dynamics of this sort of thing in many, many countries of the world. So everything we're talking about today is in some way like a microcosm of what extractive practices and extractive capitalism mean around the world. But I'm going to be focusing on, like, what does it mean to use the law strategically when you're dealing with these sorts of abuses, right? Because, you know, it's very easy to kind of have this shorthand and say, yeah, we want to get justice, but what does that even look like, right? So, and this is something that Gilberto talked about, we did this book together, was precisely to address this sort of question. Like, how can you use the law to achieve justice when it's the law itself that underwrites the immense harm caused by multinational corporations around the world? International economic law is set up deliberately in such a way as to privilege the commercial rights of large companies over the rights of peoples and the environment. The corporation itself, right? You often hear people now talk about corporate impunity, right? The corporation itself was set up as a legal structure from the 18th, 19th centuries, precisely so that the owners of capital didn't have to take responsibility and weren't liable for their actions. So why does BP have a subsidiary, a censor? So that's because it means that the censor has separate personhood, separate legal personhood from BP, and BP can say, no, it wasn't us, even though they have, you know, shareholders in the company. So shareholders in companies always have limited liability for the actions that, you know, that take place through the company's operations. And there's been a lot of focus in international law recently on better ways of making sure that multinationals show due diligence for human rights. And actually exercise a sort of duty of vigilance over what their subsidiaries are doing. But none of this really addresses the question which Gilberto and I were talking about when we were on a road trip, a speaking tour that he did of the UK in 2014. Okay, so what does it actually mean to hold a corporation to account? So at that point, Gilberto had just filed proceedings in the High Court in London against BP. But we firstly knew that it was very, very unlikely that that was going to be successful. It was very unlikely because for numerous reasons to do with costs. And you have a big company that's set up against, you know, an individual supported by lawyers, mostly volunteering. But you also have problems around actually attributing the acts to a particular corporate actor. So even though a corporation is like a person in law, if you want to hold that corporation liable, and I won't go into the technicalities of it, you've got to find the individuals who carried out the actions. So who in BP or in Ocensa actually said to those paramilitaries, yeah, hey, we'll give you $40,000, right? So it's all set up in such a way that it makes it incredibly difficult to hold a company to account. But then what does that even mean, right? Even if those proceedings are successful, what you get is a kind of commodified relationship of liability. So, you know, the company can pay off the harm that it's caused, and it can bring that into its calculation of profit and risk and just carry on. There was another case, the Colombian Food Workers Union, who had a boycott campaign and an international lawsuit against Coca-Cola for murders and threats against trade union leaders. And they were actually offered a settlement from Coca-Cola that they refused. It was a really, you know, financially, their lawyers were like, this is amazing. This is this really generous settlement. And they said, yeah, but it's tied to a non-disparagement clause that means that we can't talk about what's happened. And for us, what justice means is reversing all those neoliberal reforms and reversing the precarious labor relations that led to the protests that led to people being killed. So they actually turned down the money. So this is where, from this kind of situation that we've started talking with Gilberto, with Sebastian, who's going to talk to you in a minute about what is it, you know, we often talk about using the law strategically, but what does it mean? Given that the law is designed to protect corporations, and often what, you know, well-meaning lawyers and activists can end up doing is almost sanitizing the law, like giving the idea actually, well, the law is this kind of neutral, benign tool for justice, and all we have to do is make sure that corporations obey the law. Another issue around the problems of legal strategies is the inability of law to fully recognize the harm that's been caused. So to give you another example, which is a similar case to the Yukpa people, a friend of ours, Gilberto mentioned Universidad Libre, there's a lawyer there, Gustavo Rojas Paez, who has been following the case of the Wayu indigenous people and their resistance to I think the largest open cast coal mine in Colombia, the Cerrejón mine. And between 2008 and 2016, I think it was, nearly, I think it's 4,770 Wayu indigenous children died as a result of hunger, malnutrition, thirst from the diversion of the pollution as well, but largely from the diversion of the river to by the mine. And the Wayu people put in a complaint to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, where they talked about, you know, well, the river has been privatized, and you have to wonder, you know, this is like the Yukpa people were talking about. This is, you know, immense harm to Mother Nature within an indigenous cosmovision. This is, you know, a huge harm to planet Earth in general, and this is what needs to be addressed. But the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights could only basically order what precautionary measures based on protecting individual rights at the level of making sure that Wayu children and adolescents get enough drinking water, right? So, you know, and that didn't even get fulfilled, but the idea was, oh, let's bring in a load of tanks of water, and that's gonna, you know, that's gonna help protect human rights. So the law doesn't always have the resources and the categories, at least as it's dominantly interpreted, to be able to address the kind of harm caused by capitalism. And so there's this huge gap between the actual cause of the harm and the legal means of recognizing that harm and establishing responsibility for it. And so one of the things that, you know, we've been talking about is, well, how do you use the law without sanitizing the law, recognizing the limitations on using law, but at the same time finding it necessary to use law to stop these sorts of abuses from occurring, at least to some extent. And something Gilberto didn't talk about, but that his court case in the UK was accompanied by a campaign called Oil Justice that was about shedding light on these wider activities of the oil companies in Colombia, including the environmental harm, the murders of campesinos, of peasant populations living around the oil fields, and linking it directly to a particular economic model that's based upon extraction of natural resources, and trying to highlight, look, actually it's the law itself that needs to change. Well, just trying to think what else I was going to tell you about. Oh yeah, so I was going to talk to you about the, you know, we had this campaign ongoing, and then we actually got some funding to go back out to Colombia, and got together with a group of lawyers and social movement leaders. So some of the peasant leaders from Casanare, the lawyer for the Yukpa was part of this discussion to actually think more about, well, what does it mean to use the law strategically? And one of the things that we talked about is how can you use the law in such a way that you can broaden the definition of harm, so that the harm isn't just this individual act that, you know, like Gilberto getting kidnapped, but it's something that's got structural conditions and structural roots. And then another question that came out of this was, well, how do you get a dialogue between the way in which Western international law is, you know, dominant narratives and understandings of international law are constructed, and the cosmological visions of indigenous peoples and other ways of knowing, other ways of understanding harm, justice, and so on. How do you, these are very much open questions, but how do you do that in campaigns surrounding the strategic use of law? And I think one of the, I mean, for me, that I've been thinking about sort of more recently in the book I've got coming out, is thinking about the ways in which social movement lawyers can use law and legal argument in ways that actually undermine this idea that the law is neutral and benign or definitive of justice. And one example of this, just to pin it down a bit, is the People's Permanent Tribunal. So the People's Permanent Tribunal is an unofficial international court it came out of the Russell tribunals on US war crimes in Vietnam in the 1970s. And it's basically set up that where international crimes remain in impunity, they get legal experts, judges together to actually hear the evidence and issue a ruling on those crimes. And it's, in many ways it's symbolic, although it can sometimes serve as a precedent for future jurisprudence. And so one of the things that the People's Permanent Tribunal have done, for example, in Colombia, they had a series of hearings into transnational corporations and crimes against humanity. They did things like redefined international law on genocide. So there is a debate within international law of like, what is genocide? How do we think about genocide? And normally, the dominant understanding of genocide is that it's a crime of specific intent. So you have to intend to wipe out, to annihilate a particular group. Whereas the judges in the People's Permanent Tribunal drew on, there's a lot of scholarship in international law arguing this, saying, well, actually, no, it can also be a crime of omission. So if the Colombian state, the multinationals, and so on, know that they're actually, the sorts of extractive projects that they're promoting and giving contracts for are going to mean wiping out indigenous peoples. I mean, the Yukpas talk about their cultural and, extermination and their literal extermination as a result of the mines and the paramilitary activity that surrounded it. And so the People's Permanent Tribunal said, well, look, this is genocidal. And if we understand these economic policies and the actions of the multinationals as inherently genocidal, then the tribunal has to give a judgment not just on these specific acts of paramilitaries displacing people, not just on specific acts of diverting a river and so on, but on the whole economic model itself that's based upon the accumulation of wealth. The economic model itself is inherently genocidal. So I won't carry on for too much longer, but just to say, I guess that this is something that I'm really interested and some people in working in Colombia are really interested in opening up a conversation about. Okay, if with a campaign in support of the Yukpa using strategic use of law, and we can talk about how they've got some different legal actions going on, how is it possible to have a campaign supporting that both helps exert pressure, but at the same time is undermining that idea that, well, the law is just neutral, the law is benign, the law isn't also underpinning these acts that many lawyers would describe as genocidal.
Sí.
So, May, can you put the light on?
So for our last speaker tonight, we're going to have Sebastian Muñoz. Sebastian is the Senior Programs Officer at the radical anti-poverty organization War on Want. Sebastian has been working closely with grassroots social movements, with regional networks, and with frontline communities in developing justice-oriented approaches against the social and ecological crises. Sebastian is also helping to coordinate the Global Green New Deal, as well as the project for post-extractivist futures. Personally, Sebastian has been a really important teacher and mentor into how activism has to be mixed with radicalism, but also care. So I'm very happy to introduce my compa, Sebastian.
Hey everybody, Helena, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for kind of the sensitivity with which you organize the space. Your energy is abundant and it shows. It's interesting that in the same way which you kindly refer to me as a mentor, Lara and Gilberto also accompanied me back when I was a volunteer collaborating in the project that Lara and Gilberto were naming. And so it feels like there's an intergenerational dialogue coming here today. Also, especially because, and something that I'm very grateful about, my little baby daughter, Aini, who's right there, is joining us too for the very first time. And it's a moment of deep hope in Colombia. And that's what I want to center on in the few minutes that I have. The realities of extractivist violence, the realities of colonial violence and neoliberalism, and the way in which capitalism has extracted and exploited and undervalued land, territories, and communities that Gilberto, that the compas from the Yukpas community that Lara was describing so well, have come to a watershed moment. And that's because just under 2 weeks ago, for the very first time in 200 years, the Colombian people democratically elected the first left-wing government in history. The election of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez is historic, it's generational, it's such a glimmer and a beam of hope. And because it isn't any just left-wing government, this is a left-wing government that's formed primarily through the construction of resistance of social movements, much like Lara and Gilberto and others described. It's the culmination and the accumulation of so many years of struggle, of decades of resistance, of so many different facets to the struggle of dignity. So I think everyone who has ever stood in solidarity with Colombian struggles and in solidarity with community involved in social and environmental conflict, all of us who have also added a little grain of salt or sand, sorry, sand to the building up of those resistances should feel ownership over what was achieved just 2 weeks ago. I want to talk about the prospects and the possibilities for transformation that this new government brings, not from the perspective of someone who believes that electoral power or being in government is the only form of power or the only way in which transformation happens, but just because the radical nature of this particular government it needs to be named. I think we all need to understand that the context for internationalism, the context for the fight for climate justice, and the context for ecological restoration, given this new government, changes, and that landscape is something that I want to touch on. So what I'm going to do is just mention a few kind of key points of inspiration that I think are relevant for us today, and then maybe go into some of the lessons that I think we can take from the way in which the campaign was built and what it means for building power and for achieving climate justice. Now, just to say that what I'm going to share with you is also an accumulation of analysis that's being done together with many different people. I'm just going to name a few who've written publicly about this. Tatiana Garavito, Nathan Tanki, Daniel Goskoboynik, and Maria Pasolinca, who have a series of wonderful articles for an English-speaking audience that helps to kind of illustrate the nuances of why this historic win is so very important. All right, so I'll get into it after all that. I think the first thing to say is that Francia Marquez is the vice president of Colombia, the vice president-elect of Colombia, is an Afro-descendant woman, is a Black woman who is an environmental lawyer, who is from a community called La Toma in Cauca, who grew up in resistance to gold mining projects, who grew up in a community defending land, defending territory. And her election as vice president of Colombia is perhaps the most, the single most inspiring rupture that I've ever seen with political establishment and what it's thrown up in terms of anti-racism, in terms of anti-extractivism, in terms of the fight for climate justice, in terms of the ways in which we build a different political culture in Colombia. Francia Marquez represents in many ways and brought together through the Pacto Histórico the most marginalized communities in Colombia. LGBTQI+ people, disabled people, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, the working class, women are the people who were represented in the campaign. So this breathed new life into the way in which politics happened in Colombia and the deep dynamics of violence that were entrenched. And so the second thing I want to mention has to do with the way in which their win is a win for ecology, and the way in which ecological justice is at the very center of their political program. They are not simply cognizant of the climate crisis. They recognize, because they have been involved in territorial struggles for their whole life, that that in order to address the climate crisis, we have to fundamentally end Colombia's dependence on fossil fuels, that we have to fundamentally move away from this fossil fuel economy and effect a just transition in Colombia. We have to move towards a regenerative economy. And that was captured by the language that Francia Marquez used to refer to Mother Nature, to the earth as our great womb or our great home. And I think that that way in which ecological environmental justice is being put at the center of the campaign is really the bedrock of the potential for a region-wide campaign towards a just transition. And something that Petro said when he won, which I think is really relevant, is that the current high prices of oil, coal, and gas cannot be the basis for economic and social justice. And what he's referring to is to other progressive governments in the region in the early 2000s that saw the way redistribution of profits from fossil fuel operations and from other extractivist projects as the way in which you could address economic and social justice. But obviously that was a failed model and a failed example of being able to address certain inequalities for a short period of time, but being completely dependent on international markets, on commodity prices, to be able to affect the type of transformation long-term that's needed. So Petro and Francia have it very clear that that no just transition is possible while we are dependent on international markets, and that's simply the case at the moment with Colombia. The third thing I want to mention that I think encapsulates and embodies the ways in which this government is going to propose that we move from an extractivist economy towards an economy for life is through the concept of vivir sabroso. And this is something that is owned, I suppose, or that is personal and deeply rooted in the Black and indigenous communities of the Colombian Pacific. Vivir sabroso could be translated as living deliciously or living enjoyably. Basically, it denotes a life of abundance. It denotes a life of recognizing that abundance comes from living in harmony with others and living in harmony with Mother Earth. Vivir sabroso means not living in fear. It means living in dignity. And Francia Marquez embodies that in such powerful and beautiful ways. And that I guess, is the way in, or the attempt by the Pacto Histórico, by Francia Marquez, by Gustavo Petro, to try and usher us towards an economy that centers life. The fourth, I have two more things to say, maybe three. Linked to this notion of vivir sabroso and where it comes from, recognizing that Afro-Colombian communities have been the most marginalized in many ways. They've had to face structural racism for 400 years in Colombia, and 200 since it became a nation state. They've had to endure all the type of socio-environmental conflict that was described at the hands of multinationals, as well as the armed conflict. And actually, I think what Edward and what the Yukpa community was saying is the clearest illustration. Armed conflict doesn't cause displacement. Displacement isn't an effect of the armed conflict. The armed conflict was happening so that there could be displacement for international economic interests to be able to appropriate those lands. So I think the fight of Francia Marquez and the movement that she represents, which is called Soy porque somos, which is that saying over there in that beautiful poster that Helena put together. Soy porque somos means I am because we are, and it's from from Ubuntu, which Ubuntu comes from where else in Africa? Is it Kosa? Kosa? Okay. Yuba, in Nigeria, okay. That's such a profound message in such a deeply racist country like Colombia is. So Francia Marquez isn't only kind of represents the anti-racist struggle in Colombia, but she also is holding up a mirror. And what she says, it's not my role to educate mestizos, people like me, white Colombians, on how it is that we should fight racism. But I think what she is doing is opening up a series of conversations about the way in which racism has affected minorities, and primarily indigenous and Afro-Colombians, in such a profound way that it's a moment of reckoning. So those are some of the things that I think are really hopeful for this one. And maybe just to end on, I don't know how long yeah, just a couple of 3 lessons that I think are relevant for us today. The first is the way in which language we use throughout the campaign, right? I've already mentioned Vivir Sabroso, but the way in which dignity can be described when it's described from the heart, when it's described from care, when it's described from a place of recognizing our relationship to Mother Earth and to other communities, had such a profound impact because people felt represented in it. Vivir Sabroso has become the slogan for the way in which we describe anything that's good right now in Colombia. That's why Francia and Petro got 11 million votes, right? Describing the ways in which we can dream through other language can be really highly effective, and they're an example of that. The second is the point that I've mentioned around how they build coalitions and how they build power. Colombia has been through a 60-year-old armed conflict, and at the moment, Petro and Francia were so clear in their messaging throughout that they wanted to govern for everyone. I know that every single politician already says this, but they have sat down with paramilitaries, they have sat down with the far right, they have sat down with the perpetrators of some of the worst violence that we've seen in Colombia, and they have said, we are ready to forgive, we are ready to reconcile, we are ready to move to a moment of collectivity. And I know that that sits difficult, that sits hard with people, that sits uncomfortably with me. But the possibility, but Colombia, of its 60 million people, is a country with 60 million people, not only of 11 million people that voted for Petro. So if I want to ever go back to Colombia, I have to learn to live with those people as well. And so this process of the peace process, which has been ongoing since 2016, which is the way in which Colombians decided to move from conflict into peace, takes a new breath of life with their election and with their ability to build coalition and build power from plurality, from diversity, and from a communal project for dignity. And the final thing, I'm sorry, it's taking so long, just because this is really relevant to us. We've heard about the ways in which corporations, be it the fossil fuel industry, be it mining corporations, are all have such their tentacles of power reach so far that they're able to capitalize on the climate crisis, that they're able to change their business plans to be able to adapt to strategic litigation that might mean that they have to pay out, essentially commodifying people's suffering. That is currently happening in Colombia and the whole of Latin America because we continue to be dependent on extractivism in order to generate profits, in order to run the economy. What Pedro is proposing, and what France and Marquez are what they're proposing in terms of the just transition, means that if they're able to mobilize regionally to stop the flow of wealth, the flow of resources, the flow of material from south to north, the flow of wealth generated through the exploitation of workers, and they're able to do that effectively, that is the single most important way in which we're going to be able to stop ecological degradation, stop the loss of biodiversity loss, and address the climate crisis. When that moment comes, and this is why we have to support the government, not be uncritical, absolutely not, and recognize the ways in which people who, well, governments, when they're in power, tend to co-opt every struggle and never lose our critical lens. But being able to support that alone, and when the moment of reckoning comes, to be able to say, to stop that moment or that flow of wealth from north to south, we have to be ready to react in terms of what that means for our society and our way of life and the way in which we consume energy and the way in which we consume energy over here, and the way in which those inequalities that we reproduce in the global south are reproduced over here. And I think that's really relevant for the fight against corporate impunity and climate justice. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much to us for those incredible words. And now we're going to move on to the very active and practical part of this event. After a short break, you can help yourselves to refreshments. We're going to put a big sheet of paper right here for everybody here. Oh, it's right there. All right. Thinking ahead, sorry. Thank you. And I encourage everybody to put your name and your email address, because tonight is the night where we planted a seed for a long-term strategy that's to come, where we're going to work after hearing all of these amazing speakers talk and after hearing what the Yukpas have to say. So I'm going to welcome everyone to sign up their names. We're going to meet weekly, bi-weekly, whatever your availability, but everyone has something to contribute. And then I'm gonna welcome our amazing facilitator, Ketanja, and he's gonna help us organize together strategy planning, where we're gonna, well, Ketan will speak a bit more about that. But before we go on to the break, I just also want to mention very briefly with my friend Pacho here about the situation that's happening in Ecuador, because that's also very important, where the indigenous movements in Ecuador and the CONAI are rising up and standing against the government of Lasso. And in this struggle, it has to be all of Abya Yala and all of the world together. So yeah, let's have a brief break. And then I welcome everyone to stay and organize. Thank you for listening.